And thank you, Jonathan, Sean, and the ExChange and Cascade groups for inviting me to speak today and for including me as part of this series. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk today about this theme of promoting social inclusion in housing and care environments for older people. And I'm going to walk you through a number of studies that I've led over the last 10 years, as Jonathan mentioned, that have led and informed the creation of 2 learning resources that are aimed at staff working in care and nursing homes for older people and in housing schemes. When I say housing schemes, primarily mean housing schemes that offer some kind of care and support to older residents. So that could include extra care housing, independent living schemes, sheltered housing, a whole range of different schemes where there's some kind of care provided on site if residents need that. So let me just go to my next slide. So what I'd like to do today is to introduce the 3 research studies that are primarily focused on the care needs and support needs of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people in later life. And I'll talk through some of the key findings from those studies that have informed the creation of the 2 learning resources that I then want to introduce and walk you through. And as I mentioned before, these are learning resources aimed at improving the knowledge and awareness of staff and managers working across different kinds of long-term care and housing environments for older people. Both resources are available online and for free, and I'll be sharing the web links to those later on in the presentation. And I'm going to demonstrate or give some examples of some of the learning resources. So I'm going to play a short video clip from one resource and, time permitting, a short audio clip from one of our podcasts on the other resource. So these are the 3 studies that I want to introduce you to today. All 3 have involved some field work with older people, residents of housing schemes, staff and stakeholders working in Wales. So the first 2 are specific to Wales and based in Wales, and the last study, diversity in care environments, straddled both England and Wales in terms of the field work and the focus of the research. All 3 studies used a mixed methods design, and by that I mean we combined a survey of residents, and in other instances a survey of staff, with some interviews and focus groups where we were able to capture more in-depth perspectives about the problem we were focusing on. So the first study, which was based at Swansea University, and we focused on the inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual residents in care and nursing homes in Wales. The second study, Trans-Aging and Care, also based at Swansea University, and there we focused on the health and social care expectations for trans individuals in later life. So that include trans individuals in midlife to later life, thinking about what older age might look for them and what their health and social care needs might be and what they expect from health and social care professionals and services in later life. And the third study, the most recent study, which straddled across England and Wales, was the DICE study, Diversity in Care Environments. And in this study, we focused, we took a wider lens looking at social inclusion practices across housing with care and support for older people. And this is where we also included schemes like extra care schemes and independent living schemes that offered some kind of care and support. And you can see along the bottom there, all the different funders that have funded this research, including the Welsh Government through their Health and Social Care Research Wales funding, the Economic and Social Research Council, and the Dunhill Medical Trust. And all 3 studies were a group effort. I was the lead investigator in all 3, but I couldn't have completed these studies without the teams across Swansea University and University of Bristol. So what have we found from these 3 studies? I just want to talk you through some of the key findings across these studies before we move to the learning resources. The first study looking at inclusion of older lesbian, gay and bisexual residents in care and nursing homes in Wales. And these are some of the myths, if you like, that we encountered in this particular project. And we were able to myth bust or present a different perspective or contrasting perspective through our research findings. So the first claim there, nobody around here identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and also transgender. And this is a claim we also heard in our field work when we were having interviews and focus groups of care and nursing staff. Occasionally, staff could remember a particular residence that stood out that may have been had diverse characteristics in terms of sexual identity or gender identity. But more often than not, we heard this claim that there's nobody around here like this within this care and nursing home. And so this led to us to open up conversations about, well, how do we know this? Perhaps residents don't feel safe or comfortable enough to be able to come out and have these conversations, to talk to staff about their sexual identity or gender identity. And perhaps there needs to be some further work in care and nursing homes and the training with staff to be able to help people feel more confident and equipped to be able to have those conversations, which can initially seem quite challenging and tricky because it can be such a morally charged issue and also stigmatizing. The second claim there, to make everyone feel equal, we should just treat everybody the same. And if you're working in health and social care services, you've probably heard this claim from other staff as well, that equality means we treat everybody the same. And again, we heard this from care and nursing staff, care home and nursing staff that we were talking to across the first project. This idea that, again, if we treat all residents the same, we give everybody the same kind of treatment and the same resources and support, level of support, then we'll level up and we'll achieve equality. And we know that's not the case because residents from minoritized groups have very different life histories. They've encountered different structural disadvantages, barriers to opportunities, patterns of inequality across their life course. And that includes older people who identify as lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender. That means that they do need to receive more tailored support, more individualized support to enable them to feel comfortable, included, and safe within their living environment. So, for example, lesbian and gay and bisexual residents may have experienced homophobia and biphobia earlier in their life. Trans residents may have experienced transphobia or different forms of oppression, for example, being dead named or misgendered in the way that people refer to them and recognize them. Or they may have experienced hate crime, and that could apply to all older people, older residents identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans. So these earlier life experiences will really shake people's confidence in being able to come out to others in later life, particularly if they've encountered these forms of oppression or discrimination from service providers in other healthcare settings or other social care services. Then this will be high in their minds in terms of being mindful of not placing themselves in a position where they might be vulnerable to further abuse or discrimination. The third claim there, that sexuality and gender diversity isn't relevant to person-centered care. And again, we heard this through some of our conversations with care and nursing home staff, that it just wasn't relevant. When we were talking about person-centered care, there are other much more important considerations. For example, people's sleeping routines, when people wanted to have their meals, what was important for them in terms of dietary preferences and meal preferences. And those things are really fundamentally important. But we also argued that actually issues about people's core identities and social identities and life histories are equally important. And that includes issues about sexual personhood and gender identity. And to be able to really deliver person-centered care, we need to know and understand more about that person's life history. And that includes who matters to them, who's mattered to them across their lifetime. That could include same-sex partners. It could include what's sometimes referred to as families of choice. And these are close friends who in every way perceived and experienced as close family members and supporters. And this is often, these are often people accumulated when LGBT individuals have experienced exclusion from biological family, or no longer have meaningful relationships or ongoing relationships with biological family. So there's a whole range of considerations that we need to think about that's about delivering good individualized care that's person-centered and takes into account all aspects of a person's identity, and that includes sexuality and gender identity. And similar to the person-centered care claim, the fourth claim there, that good care doesn't involve thinking about sexual and gender identity. And again, we'd argue that it is really important. It's important that people feel safe and comfortable, and they are able to talk about a whole range of different aspects of their identity and life history that matter to the kind of care they receive now. And that could include support to be able to have visitors as part of their social circle, significant others that are important to them, included in the life of care homes. It could include support to access events happening in the community, say, for example, pride events that people might be interested in. There's a whole range of different aspects in terms of people's current social needs and thinking about people's current social well-being that's fundamental to their good care. Sorry, I'm just moving boxes over to the side so I can read my slide. And the fifth claim there, that homophobia or transphobia isn't a problem here. Now, why we weren't able to speak to residents who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in this particular project. So we didn't have that direct evidence of people telling us about their experiences of homophobia and transphobia. Given that we'd heard some of the above claims, we were concerned that homophobia and transphobia may be an issue. And another project I was involved in, which was led through Middlesex University in London, and that was looking at also around educating care home staff about providing good inclusive care to LGBT residents. And in those conversations with staff in some of those care homes, we very much heard overt homophobic and transphobic claims from staff, which showed that we've got a long way to go in terms of raising awareness and bringing staff on board in terms of what good inclusive care looks like. So here's two quotes from two lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. The first gentleman, a gay man, and the second person identified as a lesbian. And they're both talking about their expectations, their future expectations, if they had to live and relocate into a care or nursing home. So Paul is saying that he expect to have some privacy, you know, like if he wanted to give me a kutch, referring to his partner or something like that. I mean, it'd be nice if my partner could stay over, if I had a double room or something, and people just treat him as my partner, you know, as they would for a husband and wife. I acknowledge that really. So talking about the importance of care and nursing staff, really recognizing and embracing the significant others, including partners of residents who are LGBT and trans. And Sarah, in the second quote, talking about that she couldn't imagine being in a place where everybody around you would not know that you had spent all your life as a lesbian. I mean, that would be, there was no point in living. That would be the worst thing for me, if you had to be completely in the closet with nobody knowing about you and you couldn't talk about your own life. So in this second quote, Sarah's talking about how awful it would be for her to basically to go back into the closet as someone who's been out as a lesbian for a significant part of her life. The second study was that we focused on trans aging and care, and we had some interviews with 22 trans people between the ages of 50 to 76 who were living in Wales. And this is what we learned from some of our interviews with these people. First of all, majority of the people that we spoke to had come out as trans and began medically transitioning as trans at midlife and in later life. And that's often because they didn't feel equipped to come out at trans at earlier life points, as they often didn't have the language to describe their identity and their gender. And connected to this, there was a strong lack of information about trans people's lives and identities prior to when we had the internet in the early 1990s. And for a lot of the people we spoke to, the arrival of the internet was fundamental in not only accessing information that reflected aspects of their own lives and identities, but also enabled them to connect to other trans groups and communities. They also told us that there are a range of different triggers that led to them transitioning medically. They may have transitioned socially in terms of how they dress and present and express themselves privately and to significant others, but to begin that process of accessing gender reassignment treatments. There are a multitude of factors, typically for people in their 40s and 50s, that facilitate these decisions. And that included things like experiencing divorce and separation from spouses, children leaving home as young adults, or perhaps relocating to a new country and to a new location, away from places where people had grown up. But there was a significant life changes that led to these decisions, that now was the right time. And when we talked to trans individuals about getting older and what that might look like, we found that there were two different positions. For some trans people who were well onto that transitioning journey medically, or had either completed that journey, who had access to a range of different medical treatments in terms of gender reassignment. Older age was a very exciting time. It brought new beginnings, new opportunities to be themselves and to be recognized as such. Whereas for others, other people who had been waiting a long time to access gender clinics, gender identity clinics, and to receive the treatments associated with transitioning medically, the future was very uncertain and was very ambivalent, and they held a lot of concerns about running out of time, particularly for some of the participants we spoke to who were in their 70s. So for many of the participants we spoke to, the future was uncertain, and this was connected to long delays in terms of waiting to progress to gender identity services, to get from those GP referrals and what used to be referrals through mental health services in Wales, but we no longer have that step now. There were these long delays in being able to access the appropriate clinics and to be able to start receiving gender affirming medical treatments. In terms of social care, the people we spoke to had concerns about dementia support, particularly if they're experiencing declines in their mental capacity. So declines in their capacity to make decisions about their own day-to-day lives and how they want people to treat them and respond to them. So they were worried that they would, as they lost independence and they had increasing dependency on others, that other people would make decisions for them that weren't in line with their gender identity, with their own personal preferences and priorities, that didn't match their own needs. So for example, care home staff addressing people inappropriately, addressing people in ways that didn't match their own identity or their own preferences about their own wardrobe and presentation, or aspects of their personal care being neglected by others. So Suzanne here, who was 65 years at the time we did this research in Wales, is saying it's much more difficult for an elderly transgender woman to maintain dignity in a social care context than it is for a cisgendered woman. There won't be any provision probably for looking after a transgender woman's appearance in the same way that a cisgender woman can. So just to clarify, the word cisgender that Suzanne's using there, cisgender often applies to people whose gender identity aligns with the sex assigned to them at birth. So in this quote, Suzanne's airing her concerns that basically that she won't be treated in a dignified way or be stripped of her dignity if she had to receive social care services in later life, and that there'd be unequal treatment in terms of the way that trans women would be treated compared to cisgender women. This brings me on to the final study, the DICE Diversity in Care Environment Study. And this spanned across England and Wales. And this is where we focused on housing with care for older people, which included extra care housing. This included a survey of 700 plus residents across over 100 schemes. And it also included interviewing 72 residents about their current experiences, which included a small group of residents who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. So what we learned from our large survey of residents is that a lot of schemes, participating schemes in the study, there was a lot of agreement that schemes offer positive social opportunities for social interaction and connecting with other residents, with some scope to improve and make it perhaps less challenging or uncomfortable to participate, particularly for disabled residents. And another positive finding we found across the whole sample, across our 700 plus respondents, is that housing with care residents appeared to have lower average scores for loneliness compared to older adults, so adults of similar decades and generations living in the community. And we found this out through comparing our survey findings with a longitudinal study that's been running for a long time called the English Longitudinal Study of Aging. So we used the same questions, the same measures, so we could draw some comparisons. And we also found that residents were active contributors to their communities, and this was particularly tangible during pandemic lockdowns, where there are a lot of efforts by residents to support other residents who were vulnerable because of particular health conditions or their own individual circumstances. So residents were active helpers of other people in the scheme and therefore integral to providing good support in scheme life. But when we came to our interviews with residents, we found that there was pockets of isolation for those people who belong to minoritized groups. And this included people identifying as LGBT and T. So residents from minoritized groups, this included disabled residents, LGBT residents, and residents identifying with ethnic minority groups. Often felt more isolated in their current schemes and looked more outward for social connections. So they kind of occupy this insider-outsider status where they had some connections with some neighbours in schemes, and they certainly appreciated the benefits of living in their current schemes, but they often looked outward for meaningful social interaction with groups, with significant others, with services that are important to them and often reflect aspects of their own identity that weren't necessarily reflected within scheme life. And we also found there are examples of what we call boundary setting within schemes. And this is where other residents who belong to majority groups would express homophobic or transphobic sentiments in their everyday conversations, perhaps use racist terms or outdated language. So a whole range of daily expressions that weren't necessarily targeted at residents belonging to minority groups, but nonetheless were overheard by those residents and made people feel uncomfortable and perhaps more of an outsider. So we recognize that we need some more work in terms of increasing support for residents belonging to minoritized groups in these kind of schemes to really make sure that these are good places to grow old for all residents. So here's a quote from one of our residents who identified as gay. And he says, "I got rather annoyed with a couple of people in the scheme who are actually very homophobic. I was very disappointed with some of people's attitudes." So that's the three studies and just a flavor of the findings. I've got a list of publications that were produced from all three of the studies at the end of this presentation, which people will be able to look up afterwards and get a deeper understanding of the different findings. I just now want to talk about the two resources that we created, the two learning resources. The first learning resource is called Care Under the Rainbow, and this was a collaboration between the University of Bristol, my school, the School for Policy Studies, and the Diversity Trust, which is a social enterprise aimed at supporting organisations in a whole range of different capacities to promote social diversity amongst staff and the people who access their services. So we created this resource online with a whole range of learning materials and short films, really aimed at care home staff, to help care home staff and managers feel more equipped to have those difficult conversations with all residents about what identities matter to them, both including their sexual identities and gender identities, and also to be able to address and challenge forms of oppression and discrimination that other residents and staff might express or perpetuate. So the learning resource online consists of a series of short films where we capture the perspectives and some of the life stories of people identifying, older people identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans. And it also has a short film where we spoke to some care home staff and managers from across 2 different care homes. And we were able to gather their messages for what good inclusive practice looks like and some of the initiatives that they had tried and succeeded with in terms of trying to make their communities, their residential communities, more inclusive for all. We also produced some guidance called Things You Can Do to Make Your Care Home More Inclusive for older LGBT plus residents. A shorter top tips for staff and managers in terms of creating more inclusive environments. A legal and historical timeline showing some of the important legislative changes that have led to improvements around equal treatment and equal rights for LGBT and trans people in the UK. And a series of case studies. And I think I've got an example of a case study here. Yes, here's an example of one of the 5 case studies that we've produced as part of Care Under the Rainbow. And this particular case study is focusing on a member of staff who's refusing to work with an older male resident who they perceive as one of them gays. And in this particular case study, we wanted to bring to the fore some of the tensions between strong fundamentalist religious views that some care home staff may hold about sexuality issues that may get in the way of them providing a really person-centered and inclusive service to residents, including LGBT residents. And so we wanted to include this case study for staff and managers to really get their teeth into and open up conversation about not only how they would support this resident, this gay man called Jeff, who called Jeff, and his particular needs and requests, but also how they might work with Megan, the care home staff member, in terms of reflecting on her own beliefs and values and how those particular positions might impede her practice. So we've got a series of those 5 case studies, which also reflect residents from different identities across that LGBT spectrum, and also include some intersecting factors around LGBT residents living with disabilities and belonging to various Black and minority ethnic groups as well. So we can show how some of these issues are also overlapping and connected with issues about racism and issues about disableism and barriers for disabled older people. I'm now going to just stop sharing this screen and switch to another screen because I want to play just a few minutes of one of the films that we created called Alan and Verna's Story. So just bear with me. I'm just going to swap screen share. Okay, so I'm just going to play you the first 3 to 4 minutes of Alan and Verna's story. And these were 2 gentlemen who participated in the Care Under the Rainbow project and agreed to be filmed and shared their story. Verna is living with early onset dementia. He's living with early stages of dementia, I should clarify. And he's currently living in a care home in the Bristol area. Alan is his long-term partner. And we were really delighted that they agreed to share their experiences of moving into Verna's current care home.
was born in South Africa, and lived with my parents for quite a long time. And my mother would always tell people that the person who was put up with Werner hadn't been born yet.
Your father did originally suggest that you had treatment to stop being gay.
Yes. And what did I say?
Well, you went to the psychiatrist because you'd agreed it. Do you remember?
Yeah. And I thought the psychiatrist could actually speak to my father and better than anybody else. And they said they could do something about it. And I said, that's if I want you to do something about it. But in fact, I've got to where I've got to, and I don't want to do anything else. So that was quite interesting.
I grew up in the suburbs of London until I was 11, and then my parents moved to Buckinghamshire, and then sort of slowly came out from there. We met down here in the West Country through an organisation, a gay organisation. I think it was the 3 M's actually, which is basically, it was meals, men meeting men was the name of the organisation, and we met at one of those.
It's better and better. What else can one say? As I get older, he gets nicer.
He gets more tolerant.
And no, we're both very happy, and also we're accepted here extremely well. I mean, they welcome us. They insist on. I think we didn't ask for a special bed or a special table. We accepted whatever they gave us. And somewhere along the line, they actually gave us 2 beds rather than a rug on the floor and one bed or something like that. So we were welcomed, we were treated extremely well, and have been ever since we came here.
Because Werner lives here all the time, and I actually have a house elsewhere, so I live there and come here on a Thursday and stay through till Sunday night. So they've put an extra bed in the bedroom for us, so actually they couldn't have been more helpful.
Or more welcoming. And the majority of people, as far as we know, accept us as we are. Because there's also a woman here who is ill, who likes us very much, and we all get on very well together, and we support her as much as she supports us.
I don't think I've had no sign of prejudice here.
No.
I mean, everybody's been chatty if you sit down.
But because we're comfortable with ourselves and our relationship, it spreads.
And of course, I'm flattered when people think you're my father, which happens occasionally.
I don't know about that.
There have been new staff here. There has been a change, and they're obvious. Well, I presume that they've been told that this is a gay. They obviously know that I'm here some part of the week and not all the time. So, never seen any sense of discomfort or anything else. They've been.
Okay, I'll just stop sharing there. And I'd encourage people to watch the rest of the film. It goes for just over 5 minutes. And as I mentioned before, we were so pleased that Alan and Werner were happy to share their story and their experiences. And just as an aside, you would have heard Werner mention that his parents encouraged him or wanted him to receive some treatment. And he's referring there to psychological or spiritual treatments that we might be now know as conversion treatments, to seek to work with him in changing his sexual orientation. And we know from large surveys of LGBT citizens in the UK that often older people are overrepresented or have a greater representation amongst LGBT people who have been referred to or received conversion therapy. So current calls on the current UK government to ban conversion therapy are not just about protecting younger generations from receiving those forms of unethical treatment, but they're also about recognizing some of the harms that people of older generations have experienced, either being pressured to receive that or actually receiving some of those treatments. And I understand that the Welsh Government is pushing ahead in seeking to get that ban in place in Wales, regardless of the UK government's decisions. Okay, so there are the 4 stories, Care Under the Rainbow, as well as Werner and Alan's story. We've got a story about creating trans inclusion, perspectives of lesbian, gay and bisexual people in mid to later life about what inclusion would look like for them, and the perspectives of care home staff and some of the initiatives that they've put into place. And the final resource, the second resource I want to talk about, is the Diversity and Learning Environment resource. And this is based on our project looking at housing with care and inclusion. It was developed in collaboration with the Housing Learning and Improvement Network, Housing LIN, which works with housing providers across the UK, including in Wales. And again, this is online, all resources available for free to use. And it's aimed at schemes, managers and housing staff, and includes a series of podcasts, different stories from residents from different social backgrounds, giving their perspective about what they value within their current scheme, as well as some of the challenges they experienced when they relocated into their scheme. And this set of resources is about increasing awareness of social difference and diversity amongst older residents. So increasing the awareness of staff, seeking to illustrate forms of discrimination and inequality experienced by residents belonging to minoritized groups, and to provide a platform for opening up conversations and reflections amongst staff about the ways they can promote more, or they can do more work around promoting socially inclusive environments, both in terms of individual interaction with residents and also across schemes, so at a scheme-based level. So we've got these great series of podcasts that we've produced, which capture the voices, the individual stories of 5 residents who are all 60 years and over, and they're currently living in housing with care, including some living in extra care. Their identities reflect differences across sexual orientation, gender and gender identity, disability and ethnic background. And often some of these contributors identify with or belong to multiple minority groups. So through these podcasts, we also want to bring to the fore some of those intersecting identities, particularly around the intersections between disability and aging, and the unique challenges and barriers that can create for residents. And we have a 6th podcast, which is about the study, where we talk more in depth about the DICE study. We've also created this learning resource tool, which you can see pictured here on the left, which is a learning tool to accompany each of the podcasts. And it gives different strategies, different ways, different methods in which the podcasts can be integrated into staff training. And we've outlined ways that include using some of the podcasts as assessing tools for when interviewing new staff, potential new staff, and assessing people's beliefs and values, core values. And then we've also suggested ways in which the podcast can be integrated into training for new staff around issues of social inclusion and diversity and anti-discriminatory practice. And then we've also suggested ways in which the podcasts might be used in opening up conversations with residents, current residents, about what it means to be a good neighbour and what that would look like. So we have for each podcast contributor key discussion questions, key legislation highlighted that staff and managers need to think about, including considerations under the Equality Act, and some key learning points to really highlight and pull out the key messages from our resident contributors, and different ways this can be used in terms of staff recruitment, small group training around diversity and equality, and that conversation started with residents, preferably with groups of residents where we can generate some more detailed discussion about providing an inclusive neighbourhood. So just to highlight, this is one of the podcasts. This is episode 4. This is Sasha's story. Sasha is a lesbian in her late 60s. Sasha lives alone in a housing scheme. Sasha identifies as Jewish, lesbian, and German. And interestingly, Sasha also used to be a manager of a housing scheme. So she brings that insider perspective in terms of running a housing scheme as well. And she views herself as a minority amongst other residents, both on the basis of her disabilities and sexuality. So Sasha has a long-term health condition, as well as mental health conditions, which together impact on her the restrictions around how much she can interact with other people outside of her apartment, and the importance of solitude to her as a key part of her day-to-day well-being. And in the podcast, it goes for about 10 to 12 minutes. She highlights some of her experiences, some really positive and some less positive. So for example, her reflections on no longer attending an outdoor activities run for residents due to some of the racist views that she'd encountered expressed by other residents. So I'd encourage people to have a listen to Sasha's story, maybe over lunch or a tea break. It's a really good starting point to becoming more familiar with this resource and thinking about how this might be used in your own staff training. Okay, I was going to give people a short exercise about what I can do to make my practice more inclusive to LGBT plus older people. But given I've gone a little bit over time, I think I might leave this question with people to think about. And so just to mull over that after this session, and perhaps write it down before the end of the day, just so you can reflect on and think about, what does this mean for my own practice? But I'm going to stop sharing there. I just want to highlight at the end of this presentation, which you'll have a copy of, all the website links that I mentioned before, and a range of other websites which are both Wales specific and more UK wide. And lots of further reading, all the different papers we've published from the 3 studies I mentioned. More on the way, but this is a good starting point.
Hi, Paul, and thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask you, what is your experience in terms of uptake of these resources by providers? If you've had any conversations or experienced any barriers or facilitators of getting these resources out in practice as a researcher?
Sure. So we keep an eye on the numbers in terms of people, the number of kind of hits and views. So that's kind of very easy stuff easy information to gather, to get a sense of are people actually watching it. In terms of the Care Under the Rainbow, we presented it to different care homes in person, and we held a launch event in an extra care scheme in North Bristol back in 2019, just before the pandemic hit us all. And we were able to share it with a number of representatives from different care homes in the area. And we were also able to, we had some funding left over to be able to send out postcards about the resource to a range of staff, a range of care homes. So there is different ways of trying to get reach. It's been a little hard to keep track of in terms of uptake. I think that's been probably the biggest challenge, and not helped by COVID arriving pretty much after we launched it. So it's been difficult to kind of go back and have those conversations. But I think we've got a better handle on it with the DICE, the Diversity in Care Environment Learning Resource, because we're actually working with a housing provider in England, around the Midlands area, in terms of piloting some of these resources as part of their staff training. So able to kind of follow through how some of these resources might be used in practice and what that might look like.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think
I know your work's focusing on care homes, so we should keep talking about whether we
absolutely
can, shared resources we can we can use and develop from this.
Absolutely, because I think it's fantastic, the resource you've developed, and my only worry is like, how do we make sure that it gets to the right people and it actually gets, we facilitate use in practice? And no, absolutely, thank you so much.
No problem. I think you're muted, Jonathan.
Apologies. Thanks for that, Jolie. We've got a question from Alison Rees. You should be able to speak now, Alison, I think.
Yeah, I think I can. Yeah, I was just, I suppose, really picking up on both the two previous comments, really, about whether you've got any anecdotal examples of how people have taken things forward and actually how that's changed things.
Can you repeat that again, Alison?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just really asking about how homes have taken this forward, and whether you've got any anecdotal examples of how they've changed practice as a result of using the resources.
Sure. The DICE one is early days, I think, because we launched it at the beginning of this year. And as I mentioned before, we're in the process of working with a housing provider in terms of piloting it. We've had some small amounts of anecdotal feedback from care home staff, particularly managers, in terms of welcoming the resource and seeing how it could be useful in terms of opening up conversations with their staff. And it was a way of leading people into those what can appear to be difficult conversations. I guess the tricky thing is that you probably often hear from the care homes that are perhaps already on board, the managers on board. So that the challenge there is, how do we reach those care home managers and those care homes where there's a less interest, or it's seen as less of a priority on their radar. And if anyone has any reflections around that or suggestions around that, or particular homes they want to point me towards, that would be great.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul.
Paul, I was wondering, in a kind of similar note, really, is there a particular example of good practice that stands out to you from your studies, you know, where you came across a home where you perhaps did some interviews or something, and you had very positive experience? Clearly, Werner and Alan in that video were quite happy with their environment now, weren't they? But I mean, you might have more to say about a particularly, you know, all-round good example that you came across.
Sure. So one company, which runs a number of care homes in the southwest area of England, they had done initiatives like hosting pride events and LGBT history events. They hosted every week was some kind of event or celebration in this home. It was a very busy home in lots of positive ways. So that was one really great example where they'd sought to create an inviting environment for residents to think about some of these issues and what it might mean to other residents and what it might mean to staff. And they'd also had staff who were out. And I think that's a really important indicator. If LGBT staff feel comfortable being out in those environments and having residents know that, I think that's a really good tick in the box in terms of there are good things happening in this environment. And it's encouraging for residents as well. And they'd also had a wedding. So a staff member was getting married to his partner, and they'd had a wedding celebration for this particular staff member in the home, and all residents were invited, and they were a key part of the celebration. In terms of housing and care and extra care, I think it's really important. We've seen some really important practice about inviting external groups and organisations to use the space, communal spaces within housing schemes. So we've heard great examples about, on a slight tangent but related, dementia cafes being held within communal areas and housing schemes on a weekly basis. Residents aren't required or expected to attend that cafe, but they notice it, they walk past it, they see it as part of the kind of regular fabric of scheme life. So I think that kind of initiative, which could be applied to LGBT services, groups, organisations, where they're encouraged to, for example, meet regularly in scheme spaces, but also just come in and have conversations with residents, is also a really beneficial initiative.
That's great, Paul. Thank you.
And leadership, I've got to say that. I think leadership is fundamental. It needs to come from the top, and that's come through all three projects loud and clear. And that's where we can see the difference. If you have a manager on board who's willing to bring their staff on board and deal with some of the fallout that might arise from that, then I think that's half the battle won. And thank you, Jonathan, Sean, and